The best wedding gift would be for you to disappear from this family. My daughter-in-law's voice was as sharp as a knife, and my son's shove put an end to my last shred of patience. Where could I go when the very house I had paid for had become the most dangerous place? Hello there, my sisters. This is Bradley. Down here in Florida, the air feels a little softer today, but inside, I am weathering a storm no forecast could ever predict. How are you all doing? Have you ever felt like a grand old oak tree, spending your whole life providing shade and shelter for your children, only to have them try and cut down the very roots that gave them life? If you are sitting there needing a bit of comfort today, please hit that like button or leave me a message saying, God is always with you, so we can lift each other up. The story I need to share with you today. It began at a dinner table that should have been filled with joy, but ended with a truth so cold it froze my soul. I can still smell that sweet vanilla candle burning in the living room that evening. I had lit it thinking we would have a soft, honest talk about the $14,000 in extra wedding costs Michael and Amanda were demanding, even after I had already put over $124,000 into this house for them. Michael sat there with heavy, glazed eyes, his breath smelling of that cheap whiskey he has been leaning on lately. Amanda did not even look up from her phone, scrolling through designer wedding dresses like money just falls from the sky. When I quietly mentioned that I could not stretch my retirement any further because inflation was already eating away at my savings, Amanda finally looked at me. She had a coldness in her eyes I did not recognize and said that the best wedding gift I could give them would be to just disappear from this family. My heart clamped shut, and it felt like every bit of oxygen had been sucked right out of the room. I stood up, my legs trembling, looking at Michael for some kind of protection. I asked him if he heard what she said, reminding him that I had sacrificed everything for them. But my son did not defend me. He stood up fast, his face twisted in a way that scared me, and he roared that my sacrifices were the very thing killing them. Before I could even breathe, he reached out and shoved my shoulders so hard I went stumbling back. My side and my left arm slammed into the edge of the heavy oak table. A dry crack echoed in my mind. It was not a bone breaking. It was the sound of my soul shattering into 1,000 pieces. Michael just stood there with his fists clenched, chest heaving, while Amanda looked on with total indifference, as if I were nothing more than a fallen leaf on the porch. I looked at the boy I used to stay up with all night when he had a fever, the boy whose diapers I changed and whose knees I bandaged, and all I saw was a stranger who looked at me like an enemy. I pulled myself up, stumbling toward the hallway without saying another word. I went straight to my room and turned the lock, the click sounding like a final goodbye. In the dark, a dull throb began to spread through my arm. But that physical pain was only the beginning of a very long night of finally waking up to the truth. The next morning, the sun peeked through the blinds of my bedroom, but it did not bring a single bit of warmth with it. I slowly rolled up the sleeve of my nightgown, and there it was, a deep, ugly bruise blooming against my brown skin like a dark cloud. I touched the edges of it just a little, and the sharp sting made me shiver, pulling me right back to that moment in the living room. I looked at myself in the mirror and whispered a question to the tired woman looking back. Is this really what 30 years of breaking my back was for? I thought about all those long, lonely night shifts I pulled at the hospital, my feet swollen and aching inside my old Skechers shoes, just so I could save every penny for Michael's college. I remembered how happy I felt when I pulled $124,000 out of my life savings to help them buy this house, truly believing I was building a soft place for all of us to land in my old age. but staring at that mark on my arm. The fog finally started to clear, and I saw the pattern I had been too blind to acknowledge before. Amanda was only ever sweet when she needed me to cover her $20,000 credit card bills, or when she wanted me to fund another one of their fancy vacations. And Michael, my own flesh and blood, used whiskey to hide from his responsibilities, turning his frustration into a weapon against me whenever his wife pressed him for more money. I used to think I was the heart of this family, the one holding everything together. But the truth was much uglier. I had become nothing more than a walking ATM to them. And now, I was a punching bag they used to vent their anger. Michael's silence after he shoved me last night hurt deeper than any bruise ever could. "Enough," I whispered into the quiet of the room. "It is finally time for this mother to start looking out for herself." I reached for my suitcase and started folding my clothes, one piece at a time. I moved slowly and quietly, making sure the floorboards did not groan, because I could not stay another hour in a place where my very safety was a question mark. I needed a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe again without looking over my shoulder, and I knew exactly where I had to go. I left that house while it was still wrapped in the heavy silence of whiskey and selfishness. I checked into a small hotel right on the water, a place where the sound of the Atlantic waves could drown out the quiet crying in my soul. For the first time in years, I sat myself down and ordered a real breakfast, some fluffy pancakes and a cup of steaming hot coffee, without having to worry if Michael was nursing a hangover or if Amanda was scoffing at the cost of the meal. I pulled out my Kindle, not to stress over bank statements, but to finally finish that story I had set aside so long ago. Just breathing in the air in a room that was entirely mine, even for a night, felt like a liberation I had almost stopped dreaming about. I picked up the phone and called Margaret, an old friend who is as sharp a lawyer as they come. Hearing her voice was like finding a life jacket in the middle of a rough sea. Margaret did not judge me for a second. She just listened as I told her about the shove and the $124,000 of my hard-earned money that was sitting in those walls. "Bradley," she told me with a voice as steady as a rock, "you have a 35% stake in that property, and we are going to get back exactly what belongs to you." Hearing her say that made me feel like I was not just some tired old woman being pushed around by her own children anymore. I was starting to rebuild my life, one solid brick at a time. But that peace did not last nearly long enough. Michael was starting to realize the well had run dry and the ATM was closed. My phone began to buzz on the nightstand, and I knew right then that the first real storm was about to break. My sisters, have any of you ever had to walk out of your own front door just to find a little bit of peace for your spirit? Leave me a comment saying, "Peace," if you agree that we all deserve to feel safe and respected in our golden years. Do you want to know what Michael had to say for himself when I did not pick up? Let us keep going. I was sitting in a little cafe near the beach, my fingers tracing the edges of a warm corn muffin. The taste took me right back to those humid North Carolina mornings when my mama would bake a batch before the sun even hit the porch, reminding me of where I came from. My phone started buzzing, vibrating against the wooden table. It was Michael. I felt my stomach do a nervous little flip, but I answered. His voice was not the roar I heard last night. Instead, it was that sweet, soft tone he used to have when he was a little boy asking for a treat. He told me he and Amanda were worried sick and that they were so sorry about dinner, saying everyone was just on edge with the wedding planning. I looked out the window and saw those heavy charcoal gray clouds that always signal a Florida storm is on its way. For a second, a tiny spark of hope tried to light up in my chest. But the reality of the bruise on my arm snuffed it out like a candle in the wind. Then he started leaning on my heartstrings, the way he has done 1,000 times before to get what he wants. He told me Amanda had been crying her eyes out all night with regret and that the wedding vendors were breathing down their necks for final payments. He said they just needed another $5,000 to make everything right for the big day. If I came back home, Mo, he promised he would take me out to that fancy steakhouse I love so much for a real family dinner. I sat there in the quiet, listening to his calculated sighs through the receiver. Not once did he ask if I was hurt or how my arm was doing after he threw me against that table. He did not care about my pain. He only cared about the debt and the fancy show Amanda wanted to put on. I gripped my phone tight, and that familiar guilt I usually felt started to wash away, replaced by a clarity that was as sharp as glass. I took a long, deep breath and kept my voice as steady as a church bell. I told him I was exactly where I needed to be, and as for the wedding, I had already called the planners to let them know I would not be paying another dime. There was a silence on the other end that felt like a tomb. Just like that, the sweet talk vanished. He started shouting, asking me how I could be so selfish and try to ruin their big day. In the background, I could hear Amanda's voice piercing through the air, calling me a crazy old woman and a bitter hag. Those words used to make me retreat into my shell and cry, but today, they just felt like rain sliding off a leaf. I realized right then that they did not have a hook in me anymore, and the manipulation was failing. I hung up the phone, just as Michael started using words that would have made his father ashamed to hear. My hand was shaking a little, but my mind had never been clearer. I thought about my grandmother, a woman who survived the hardest years of the Depression down south with nothing but her faith and her dignity. She used to tell me to never let a person use love as a rope to tie your feet. I walked out of that cafe and breathed in the salt air, feeling it sting my lungs in the best way possible. A strange kind of confidence was starting to grow inside me, something I had not felt in a very long time. This was not just about the money anymore. It was about saving the last bit of self-respect I had left, a respect I had almost lost in a house I paid for myself. But I know Michael. He has always been the type to push when words do not get him what he wants. Sure enough, only a few hours later, a heavy, frantic pounding on my hotel door rattled the walls and shattered my brief moment of peace. The real storm had not just reached the coast. It was standing right outside my door. The door to my hotel room didn't just open. It flew back against the wall with a bang that made my heart jump into my throat, shattering the little bit of peace I had managed to scrape together. There stood Michael, his face flushed a deep, angry red, smelling like the same cheap whiskey he'd been drowning himself in the night he shoved me. Amanda was standing right behind him, her arms crossed tight over her chest, and that same look of pure disgust she always saved for me, looking at me like I was something she'd stepped in on the sidewalk. He roared at me, asking if I really thought I could just hide out here and ruin their lives by cutting them off. I backed away until my heels hit the edge of the bed, my hand instinctively reaching up to touch the bruise that was still throbbing under my sleeve. A physical reminder of the son I no longer recognized. Looking at him in that moment, I didn't see my baby boy anymore. I saw a stranger, a grown man consumed by a liquor-fueled rage and a sense of entitlement that turned my stomach. Amanda stepped into the room without being invited, her voice dripping with that fake pity she uses like a weapon to make me feel small. She told me to stop playing the victim and acting like a martyr, complaining about all the promises they'd already made to the wedding vendors and how I was making them look bad. Then she said the words that lit a fire in my soul, words that stripped away any last bit of hesitation I had left. She asked me if my money wasn't going to be Michael's one day anyway, and why I was clutching it so tight when they needed it right now. It was like she tossed a match into a room full of gasoline, and 30 years of suppressed hurt just exploded. All those years of working double shifts at the hospital until my ankles were swollen. The 80-hour weeks in my old Skechers that left my body numb. And the $124,000 I poured into that house. To them, it wasn't a gift or a sacrifice. It was just an inheritance they were too impatient to wait for. "My money?" I yelled, my voice booming in that small hotel room with a strength and a volume I didn't know I still had in me. I told them that money was my sweat, my tears, and the legacy Robert worked his whole life to leave me so I could have some dignity and a roof over my head in my old age. I looked Michael dead in his bloodshot eyes and pointed straight at the dark mark on my arm. I told him he shoved me, that he bruised my body and my spirit just to please a woman who didn't even see me as a human being, let alone family. For the first time, I put the truth out in the air, raw and ugly, refusing to let them sweep it under the rug like they always did. Michael flinched for a second, a flicker of genuine shame crossing his face as he looked at my arm. But his selfishness was a wall too high for his conscience to climb over that day. He shouted back at me that it was just an accident, that I was always making things out to be bigger and more dramatic than they really were. He slammed his hand down on the hotel nightstand so hard the lamp rattled, and the Bible nearly fell off the shelf. And he told me that if I didn't hand over the money for the wedding, I'd better not expect him to treat me like a mother ever again. He actually had the nerve to look me in the eye and say I was nothing more than a guest in that house. A guest? In the house where I paid for nearly every brick, every floorboard, and the very roof over his head? I saw the naked greed shining in Amanda's eyes as she nodded along with him, already measuring the rooms for her own furniture. I realized right then that if I didn't stand my ground at that very moment, I was going to lose everything I had worked for. My home, my savings, and maybe even my life if Michael's temper kept escalating. I walked over to the door, pulled it wide open, and looked my son right in his eyes with a coldness that matched his own. I told him to get out of my room, and I didn't say it twice. The steel in my voice must have caught them both off guard because for a heartbeat, the room went completely silent. Amanda tried to open her mouth to spit out another insult, but I cut her off before she could even get the first word out. I told them I had already called the bank and the planners to cancel every single remaining payment for that wedding, and that I was going to sue to get my 35% share of the house back in cash. I told them my lawyer, Margaret, would be the only person they'd be hearing from this point forward. Michael's face went from red to a ghostly pale, and he pointed a shaking finger at me, threatening that I'd regret this, and that I'd end up an old woman with nowhere to go and no one to love her. Then they stormed out, their heavy, angry footsteps fading down the hallway until I heard the elevator chime. I slammed the door shut, turned the deadbolt, and just collapsed onto the carpet, my knees finally giving out. I was bone-tired, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But deep inside the wreckage of my heart, I felt a new kind of resilience starting to take root. I sat there on that hotel floor in the dark for a long time, just listening to the sound of my own heart beating and the distant sound of the Florida waves. I thought about our people, how many storms we've had to weather, and how many times we've had to rebuild from nothing. I thought about the folks who lost every single thing they owned in Katrina, but still found a way to stand up, brush the dust off, and keep walking. Michael's shove didn't break me. It just pushed me onto the path where I finally had to stand up and fight for myself. I pulled out my phone, not to call him and apologize or beg for his love like I usually would, but to send a clear message to Margaret. I told her we were starting the process immediately and that I was finally ready to take my life back. A strange, quiet sense of peace settled over me in that dark room, not because the battle was over, but because I finally had the courage to say no and mean it. That night, sleep wouldn't come no matter how much I prayed for it. I knew I needed more than just a locked hotel door to keep me safe from the storm I had just unleashed. I needed a real defense, a way to protect my finances and my physical safety from whatever Michael and Amanda were going to try next now that they were desperate. The next morning, as the sun rose over the ocean, the legal battle for my dignity and my home officially began. Monday morning arrived with a crispness that Florida only sees a few times a year, and I was standing outside Margaret's office before the cleaning crew had even finished their rounds. When she opened the door and saw the dark, heavy bruise on my arm, she didn't waste time with small talk or empty comfort. She simply pushed a thick manila folder across her mahogany desk and told me we were going to build a fortress around my life using 3 pillars: financial security, legal standing, and personal safety. As we sat there, the smell of strong black coffee filling the air, we began the painful process of going through 2 years of my bank statements from Chase. The numbers stared back at me like cold, hard accusations of my own silence. $124,000 for the down payment on the house, nearly $20,000 to wipe out Amanda's reckless credit card debt, and a never-ending stream of smaller withdrawals Michael had made for things I couldn't even name. Seeing it all laid out on paper made the exploitation feel real in a way it never had when I was just swiping my card out of love. Each line item was a piece of my life Michael and Amanda had treated as their own, and looking at those totals gave me the kind of soldier-like focus I needed to stop the bleeding. My first stop after leaving her office was the Chase branch on the corner, a place I had visited 1,000 times before, but today felt different. I sat across from a young banker and told him I needed to close the joint account Michael had access to and move every penny of my remaining savings into a new account that only I could touch. There was a profound, quiet sense of relief when I finally held that new debit card in my hand and saw the words Bradley Mitchell printed there, standing all by itself without anyone else attached to my future. Following Margaret's strategy, we then sent a formal certified letter to Michael and Amanda notifying them that I was officially activating my 35% ownership stake in the house. It meant they would have to find $105,000 to buy me out if they wanted to keep living there, a sum I knew they didn't have sitting in a drawer. It wasn't about being cruel. It was about reclaiming the ground I had paid for with 30 years of my life. Once the money was handled, I had to secure the walls around me. On Margaret's advice, I hired a professional locksmith to head over to my old house, the one I still legally owned a large piece of, and change every single lock on every single door. I didn't stop there. I ordered a full-ring security system with cameras for the porch and the back entry so I could watch over my property right from my phone, no matter where I was staying. Watching those small black cameras get mounted under the eaves felt like I was finally giving myself the eyes I needed to see the danger before it got too close. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the hotel lobby, systematically changing every password to my email and social media accounts. Then I took the final painful step of blocking Michael's and Amanda's numbers. I was building a buffer zone, a space where their toxicity couldn't reach me. And for the first time in years, the air around me started to feel clear. During a quiet moment in the middle of all this mechanical work, I found my heart drifting back to the Michael I used to know. I remembered those summer family cruises we used to take through the Caribbean back when things were simpler. Michael was just a sweet little boy then, his face sticky with chocolate ice cream, holding my hand as we watched the turquoise water go by from the deck. I caught myself wondering how that innocent child turned into the man who could shove his own mother against a table without a second thought. But as soon as the sadness started to pull at me, the sharp throb in my arm reminded me that the boy from the cruise was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as nothing more than a source of cash. I realized that my own habit of covering for him and cleaning up his messes was exactly what had allowed that selfishness to grow into a monster. To save myself, and maybe to give him a chance to finally grow up, I knew I had to be as hard as the steel in my new locks. Margaret also insisted that I go see my primary care physician to have the bruise on my arm officially documented in my medical records. Sitting in that sterile exam room, I felt small and embarrassed at first, having to explain to my doctor of 15 years how I got that injury. But as the nurse carefully took photos and the doctor wrote down the exact dimensions and color of the mark, a different feeling started to wash over me. I realized I was being protected by the weight of the law and the healthcare system I had served for so many years. I wasn't just some confused old woman who could be pushed into a corner and silenced. I was a citizen with rights, and I was creating a paper trail that Michael couldn't shout away or manipulate with sweet talk. Taking that step made my claim to justice feel solid, like I was finally standing on firm ground instead of shifting sand. By the time the sun started to set, my feet were throbbing in my sturdy Clark's shoes, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in a decade. I went back to my hotel room and looked at the checklist Margaret and I had made, seeing every single box marked with a determined check. Safety, I realized, wasn't just about having a deadbolt or a camera. It was about the quiet power that comes from knowing you have taken back the reins of your own life. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a woman who was finally honoring the legacy of the man who had left her that money and the mother who had raised her to be strong. That night, I climbed into bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind you only get when you aren't looking over your shoulder for a betrayal that has already happened. But just when I thought I had prepared for everything the world could throw at me, a knock came at my door that wasn't frantic or angry. It was a kind of help I never saw coming, from someone I had barely spoken to in all the years I lived on my street. It was a reminder that even when your own flesh and blood turns their back on you, the universe has a way of sending an ally when you finally decide to fight for yourself. The silence that followed the shouting was the heaviest kind of quiet I had ever known, a thick layer of dust settling over a home that used to be filled with laughter and the sweet scent of Sunday dinners. I sat in my kitchen, my hands trembling as I gripped a cold mug of coffee, wondering if I had truly become a ghost in my own life. Then came a soft, hesitant knock on the back door that broke through the stillness. It was Martha, my neighbor from 2 houses down, the one who always kept her roses trimmed just so. She did not come with questions or judgment. She just stood there with a small plate of warm cornbread and eyes that saw right through my brave face. She told me she had heard the commotion from across the yard, the kind of noise that no mother should ever have to endure from her own kin. In that moment, the wall I had built around my heart just crumbled. I invited her in, the warmth of the kitchen finally starting to reach my bones as I poured us both some fresh tea. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I let the words pour out of me, sharing the secrets I had kept locked away out of a misplaced sense of family pride. I told her about the missing savings, the coldness in my own child's eyes, and the way I felt like I was disappearing a little more every day. Martha just listened, her hand resting gently on mine, reminding me that my voice still had weight and that my story mattered. She did not turn away in shock. Instead, she looked at me with a fierce kind of kindness and told me she would be right there whenever the shadows got too long. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a lifeline being thrown to a woman who had been treading water in the middle of a vast, lonely ocean. The feeling of being truly seen and understood by another soul brought a lump to my throat and a warmth to my chest that I thought I had lost forever. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with a call from Sarah, a girl I had grown up with back in the old neighborhood, someone I had only recently reached back out to after years of silence. She did not ask for explanations or apologies for the time that had passed. Sarah spoke with a voice like iron, telling me she had been thinking about everything I told her and that she was not going to let me face this storm by myself. She promised me right then and there that if it ever came down to it, she would stand up and tell the world the truth of who I was and the sacrifices I had made. Having her strength behind me felt like a sudden shift in the wind, a reminder that the roots of old friendships run deeper than any current trouble. As I looked out my window at the streetlights flickering on, the fear that had been my constant companion for so long finally started to loosen its grip. I realized that the isolation my family had tried to wrap around me like a shroud was being torn away, piece by piece. I was no longer a woman standing alone on a crumbling porch, waiting for the next blow to fall. I had a circle starting to form around me, a group of people who believed in the person I used to be and the woman I was becoming again. My faith in the goodness of folks was being restored, not by grand miracles, but by the quiet loyalty of those who chose to stay. For the first time in this long, weary journey, I knew deep in my soul that I was not going to have to fight this walk alone. A few days later, I found myself standing on the threshold of the place I used to call home, my hand trembling slightly as I turned the key in the lock. I wasn't alone this time. Margaret, my lawyer, stood beside me, her presence a quiet but steady shield as we entered to gather the last of my personal things. The air inside was thick and stifling, a far cry from the warmth and laughter that once filled these rooms when I was raising my family. As I walked through the hallway, every floorboard seemed to groan under the weight of memories that had turned sour. I made my way toward the small study, the room where Michael usually spent his evenings huddled over his work. In the bottom drawer of the heavy oak desk, tucked under a pile of old bank statements, I saw the familiar glow of a silver tablet. It was the same one I had saved up to buy for him from Amazon last Christmas, a gift meant to help him get ahead in his career. The device wasn't locked, and as I picked it up, a strange, cold curiosity took hold of me, urging me to look deeper than I ever had before. I opened the message thread between Michael and Amanda, and as the words scrolled past, the blood in my veins felt like it was turning to ice. There it was, laid out in black and white, a systematic plan to take everything I had worked a lifetime to build. They had been discussing how to convince me to put the house in Michael's name for over 6 months, starting almost the moment I had pulled $124,000 from my savings to help them with their mounting debts. The betrayal wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a map they had been drawing for half a year. One message from Amanda made my stomach turn with a sudden, violent wave of nausea. She had written that they should just let me finish paying for all the renovations first. After the house was fixed up, her plan was to find a way to put me into one of those cheap, state-run senior assisted living facilities on the outskirts of town, where the care was minimal and the walls were gray. Once I was tucked away, they intended to sell this family home and use every penny of the profit to start a new lavish life for themselves in California. Michael's response was what finally broke my heart into pieces. He had initially hesitated, but then he agreed, suggesting they could use my recent bouts of forgetfulness as a reason to seek legal guardianship over my finances. I realized then that the shove that had sent me to the floor weeks ago wasn't just a sudden burst of anger. It was the product of their growing impatience because I had finally started saying no to their endless demands for money. Every lingering illusion I had about my son's regret vanished in that moment, replaced by a stark, ugly truth. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the tablet, but the fear was gone, replaced by a white-hot sense of outrage. I took my phone and carefully photographed every single one of those messages, my thumb hovering over the screen as I sent the entire record of their cruelty directly to Margaret's email. I knew then that I held the secret weapon I needed to stand my ground when we finally walked into that courtroom. I looked around the room one last time, my eyes landing on the lazy boy recliner I had bought so Michael would have a comfortable place to rest his back after a long day. I saw the non-slip rugs I had personally installed in every hallway to keep my family safe from a fall. All that care, all that love and sacrifice, had been viewed by them as nothing more than a series of opportunities to be exploited. I closed the drawer with a firm click, took a deep breath that finally reached the bottom of my lungs, and walked out of that house without taking a single physical object. I carried something much more valuable now, the absolute proof of their betrayal. When I stepped out onto the porch, Margaret saw the look on my face and reached out, squeezing my hand with the strength of a sister. She told me that we now had everything we needed to prove the financial abuse and the calculated manipulation. A sense of absolute clarity washed over me, a quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. I knew I wasn't just fighting for a house or a bank account anymore. I was standing up to reclaim the honor of the Mitchell family name and to make sure this darkness was dragged into the light. But as the truth settled into my bones, I felt a deep, hollow exhaustion beginning to take hold. I needed a place to rest my spirit, a way to find the strength to keep going, and I knew there was only one person who could give me the peace I needed to face what was coming next. I found my way to the cemetery late that afternoon as the sun began its slow dip toward the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the quiet rows of stone. This was where Robert had been resting for 3 years now. And even though the air was cooling, sitting down beside his headstone felt like coming home to a warm hearth. I reached out and let my fingers trace the carved letters of his name, the granite feeling cold against my skin while a familiar heat rose in my chest. I started talking to him in a soft whisper, the way we used to talk late at night when the house was finally still. I told him about Michael, the boy we had been so proud of, the one we thought we had raised with a compass in his soul. My voice cracked when I told Robert how that same boy was now looking at our legacy like it was nothing more than a bank account to be drained, even planning to hawk the gold watch Robert had left him just to satisfy Amanda's hunger for a life they haven't earned. As I sat there in the silence, I could almost hear Robert's deep, steady voice carried on the evening breeze, reminding me of who I was before the world started trying to tell me I was small. He always told me that I was a strong Black woman, a pillar that had weathered enough storms to know that the wind might howl. But it wouldn't break me. He used to call me the heart of our family, and in the quiet of that graveyard, I realized that a heart is meant to give life, not to be stepped on and crushed into the dirt. The memory of his unconditional love wrapped around me like an old, familiar cardigan, giving me a surge of energy that I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for a house or some money in a savings account. I was fighting to protect the dignity of everything Robert and I had built with our sweat and our prayers over 40 long years. I wiped the tears from my cheeks and stood up, my back straighter and my chin a little higher than it had been when I walked through those gates. I looked up at the Florida sky, which was turning a deep, royal purple, and I felt a sense of peace that was as solid as the ground beneath my feet. I was done being a victim, and I was done letting greed tear apart the legacy that was meant for generations to come. As I walked back to my car, I felt ready to face whatever dirty tricks they were planning to throw my way next. Michael might still be my flesh and blood, but I wasn't going to let that bond be used as a shield for his choices anymore. That strength came just in time, because by the next morning, Amanda had already started her most vicious attack yet, trying to convince the world that I had lost my mind and could no longer care for myself. One morning, a sharp, dry knock echoed through my hotel room door, pulling me away from the quiet of my morning tea. When I opened it, I was met by a woman I had never seen before who introduced herself as a social worker from the local county office. Standing right behind her was Michael, his face twisted into a mask of fake concern that made my stomach churn with a cold sense of dread. The woman told me they had received a formal report that I was experiencing severe cognitive issues and was exhibiting behavior that suggested I might be a danger to myself. A bolt of pure, white-hot anger flashed through me as I realized exactly what they were trying to do. They were taking the very real fear of Alzheimer's, a disease that haunts so many of us in our community as we get older, and they were trying to turn it into a cage to strip me of my freedom and my home. They wanted to use my own age against me, making me out to be a confused old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own life. Michael spoke up then, his voice dripping with a sugary, false sweetness that sounded nothing like the son I had raised to be an honest man. He said they were just so worried because I had walked out of the house in the middle of the night and was acting so strangely, and they just wanted to make sure I was okay and getting the help I clearly needed. I looked him dead in the eye, seeing the cowardice hiding behind that shell of pretend worry, and I felt a profound sense of violation. It was a betrayal that went deeper than money. They were trying to steal my very identity. I didn't let myself get rattled or show them a single tear. I calmly invited the social worker inside, pulled my shoulders back, and immediately dialed Margaret's number on my cell phone. While we waited for her to arrive, I sat down at the small table and pulled out my neatly organized medical folder. I handed over the latest records from my primary care physician, a doctor I had seen for over a decade. Everything was there, documented within my Medicare network, showing that my mind was sharp, my memory was intact, and my physical health was solid for a woman of my age. The questioning that followed was intense and clinical, designed to trip me up and make me look confused in front of the state. The social worker asked me what the date was, who the president was, and how I was handling my daily spending now that I was on my own. She wanted to know why on earth a woman with a perfectly good house would choose to live in a cramped hotel room. I answered every single question with a steady, ding-dang voice and a clear mind, refusing to let them see a single crack in my composure. Then, I reached for my phone and showed the social worker the pictures I had taken of the dark, ugly bruises on my arm, and the screenshots of the messages where Michael and Amanda discussed putting me in a cheap home while they sold my property. I told her that those messages and the fear for my physical safety were the real reasons I had to leave my own front door. I watched Michael's face turn from a flushed red to a sickly pale gray as the truth of their abuse was laid out right there on the table for a government official to see. Amanda tried to jump in from the doorway, her voice shrill and desperate as she claimed that I had been suffering from short-term memory loss and that I was always getting confused about where my money went or what day of the week it was. She was trying to paint a picture of a woman who was slowly losing her grip on reality. But Margaret arrived just in time to stop her cold. My lawyer stepped forward and told the social worker that if anyone in this room needed a mental evaluation, it was the people who had been systematically plotting to steal a legacy from their own mother while she was still breathing. When Amanda suggested I see a specific doctor she had already picked out, a man she said was an expert in senior health, I stood my ground and demanded an independent evaluation at a reputable hospital of my choosing instead. I was not going to let them control the narrative or put my future into the hands of someone they had likely already influenced. My firmness made the social worker pause, and I could see the suspicion in her eyes, shifting away from me and landing squarely on the two people standing across the room. By the time the meeting was over, the social worker had seen more than enough to make her decision. She looked at Michael and Amanda and told them clearly that there wasn't a shred of evidence to show that I was unable to care for myself, or that I lacked the capacity to make my own legal and financial decisions. She noted that my records were impeccable, and my responses were perfectly coherent. Michael kept his head down, staring at the hotel carpet, and unable to look me in the eye, while Amanda stood there with her teeth clenched in a silent, bitter fury. The feeling of being cornered like an animal that had weighed on me when I first saw them at the door was gone, replaced by a powerful sense of resilience and pride. I had proven that I wasn't some senile old woman they could just push aside or lock away, and their cruel plan to turn me into a mental patient just to grab my house had fallen completely apart. Once they finally left and the room was quiet again, I sat down in a soft armchair, feeling a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but also a profound sense of relief. I had protected the most precious thing I own, which is my right to be seen as a whole, capable, and independent human being. I know how it goes, sisters. They will try anything to make us doubt our own minds and make us feel like we are becoming a burden just so they can take what we have. They use our age as a weapon, but we have to remember that our years are a badge of honor and our minds are still our own. When you have your facts straight and the truth on your side, no lie can stand for long against the light. It was a victory for my dignity and my autonomy, even if it was a heartbreaking day for a mother who never thought she would have to defend her sanity against her own child. Their attack on my health failed, but Michael and Amanda weren't finished with their greed yet. Just a few days later, I received notice that they had officially filed a lawsuit in court, hoping that the pressure and the cost of a long legal battle would finally force me to give in and hand over that $105,000 they felt entitled to. How is the weather where you all are today? Here in Florida, the storm clouds are finally starting to break after a long week of rain, and my heart feels a little lighter too. Have any of you ever had your children or grandchildren try to tell you that you were getting forgetful or lomcom just because you wouldn't do exactly what they wanted with your money? If you have been through that kind of pressure, leave a comment that says, "I am fine," so we can all stand together and remind each other that we are still here and we are still sharp. Do you want to hear how the final court case went down? Stay with me as we go to the end of this journey together. The day the legal summons finally arrived was the day the air in my small hotel room felt like it had been sucked out, replaced by a heavy, cold dread that sat like a stone in my chest. I found myself sitting across from a man in a sharp, expensive suit in Margaret's office, a man who represented Michael, but had eyes as cold and calculating as a winter storm. He pushed a thick stack of papers toward me with a practiced, condescending smile, calling it a settlement offer that would be in everyone's best interest. The words on those pages were a slap in the face, a direct insult to every year of sacrifice I had poured into my son's life. They wanted me to drop my claim for the 35% of the house's value that I had rightfully paid for with my own sweat and savings. In exchange, they were offering me the chance to move back into my old bedroom for the rest of my life, where Michael and Amanda would graciously provide for my care. It was a calculated move, one that deliberately targeted the very real fear of loneliness and the terror of being dependent on strangers that haunts so many of us as we get older. As I stared at that contract, I didn't see a gesture of family love or a path toward peace. I saw a life sentence. I saw myself trapped in that house, a prisoner in the rooms I had once filled with joy, living under the constant, sharp-edged control of Amanda, while they waited for me to finally fade away so they could claim the rest of what I owned. They thought they could use my own heart as a weapon against me, dangling the promise of a home and a familiar face to make me sign away my independence. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and heavy with the weight of their expectations. But as I looked at the signatures they were so eager for me to provide, the lolang and kangteng that had been clouded, my mind began to clear. I felt a sudden, profound tintam, a stillness that comes when you finally realize that the people you loved are no longer the people standing in front of you. I didn't say a word as I slowly pushed that contract back across the polished wooden table, my eyes never leaving the lawyer's face. I told them with a voice that was as steady as a heartbeat that I refused any deal that wasn't built on a foundation of fairness and respect. Margaret didn't miss a beat. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her own stack of documents, laying them out like a winning hand in a high-stakes game. She presented the long list of Michael's suspicious bank withdrawals, the records of his missed payments, and the undeniable evidence of the physical and emotional intimidation he had used to try and break me. I watched the lawyer's smug expression crumble, replaced by a look of genuine confusion and rising panic. They had expected a tired, frightened old woman who would be grateful for any crumb of attention they tossed her way. They never imagined that a Bagya like me would have the strength to gather such dantep evidence or the will to fight back with such precision. The power in that room shifted in a single breath, the silence now belonging to me instead of them. I felt ready, truly sansang, for whatever battle was coming next within the walls of that courthouse. I realized that I wasn't just defending my bank account or the bricks and mortar of a house in Florida. I was defending my right to be treated with dignity and the legacy that Robert and I had built together. The lawyer tried to speak, tried to find a way to spin their web of lies again, but Margaret cut him off with a sharp, professional finality. We were done talking behind closed doors. As I walked out of that office and into the bright sunlight, I knew the time for hiding was over. We had raswatlai every piece of evidence and every part of our strategy, and I was stepping into the shadow of justice with my head held high. The courtroom was filled with a heavy, humming silence, the kind that makes you notice the smallest sounds, like the steady, rhythmic rotation of the old ceiling fan overhead. I sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in the navy blue suit I usually only brought out for Sunday service at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, my back straight and my hands folded firmly in front of me. Across the aisle, Michael looked haggard and worn down, his eyes refusing to meet mine, while Amanda spent the entire morning whispering frantically into her lawyer's ear. When the judge called for my testimony, I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every year I had lived in that house. I didn't stand there as a victim seeking pity, but as a woman standing on the solid ground of the truth. I told the court about that terrible night in the kitchen, about the shove that sent me tumbling to the floor and the cold, dark bruises that stayed on my arm for weeks As a reminder of my son's anger, I spoke about the $124,000 I had pulled from my life savings, every penny earned through decades of long shifts and careful budgeting, thinking I was giving my child a future instead of funding my own betrayal. The air in the room grew even tighter when Michael's lawyer stood up to cross-examine me, his voice slick and dismissive as he tried to suggest that my fall had nothing to do with Michael. He had the nerve to claim that it was just a stumble caused by my age, a simple loss of balance from a woman who was supposedly becoming too frail and confused to live on her own. But Margaret was ready for his tricks. She stood up with a quiet authority and called our first witness, Mrs. Gable, the neighbor who had lived next door to the Mitchell house for 20 years. The room went deathly still as Mrs. Gable told the judge exactly what she had seen through my kitchen window that evening. Her voice steady as she described Michael shoving me with enough force to send me reeling. Then, Margaret produced the final crushing blow, the printed messages from the silver tablet I had found in the study. Hearing those words read aloud in court, the cold, calculated plan to ship me off to a cheap facility just so they could sell the roof over my head, felt like a second shove to my heart. But it was also the light that finally chased away their shadows. When the judge finally leaned forward to deliver his fancet kuikung, I felt a physical sensation, like a 1,000-pound weight was being lifted off my shoulders all at once. He didn't just rule in my favor. He spoke with a sternness that made the room vibrate. He ordered Michael and Amanda to return $105,000 to me, representing my rightful share of the house and the money they had manipulated away. But the part that made my breath catch in my throat was the special condition I had asked Margaret to fight for. The judge ordered Michael to immediately enroll in and complete a 6-month intensive program for alcohol abuse and professional anger management. I didn't do that to be cruel or to see him punished in a cell. I did it because I was a mother trying to pull her child back from the edge of a cliff before he lost his soul entirely. I watched Michael bury his face in his hands as the reality of the ruling set in, and for the first time in years, the wall of defiance he had built around himself finally cracked. He slumped forward, his shoulders shaking as he began to sob, the sound of a man who had finally realized the depth of what he had thrown away. Amidst his tears, he looked toward me and whispered a broken apology, admitting that he had completely lost himself in the greed and the lies. It was a bitter, painful medicine for him to take, but I knew it was the only way he would ever grow into the man Robert and I had hoped he would be. Justice had been served, but it wasn't just about the bank accounts or the property deeds anymore. It was about reclaiming the honor and the moral heart of the Mitchell family. As I walked out of that courthouse and stepped into the warm, late afternoon Florida sun, I took a long, deep breath of the fresh air. I was no longer a woman being hunted or hidden. I was a woman who was finally completely free. A few months have passed since that day in the courtroom, and life has finally slowed down into a rhythm that feels like a long, deep exhale. I decided to sell my share of the house and moved into a small, sun-drenched apartment in a senior community right near the water. My mornings are different now. I wake up to the sound of the gulls instead of the sound of my own heartbeat racing with worry. I spend my time going for long walks along the shore in my comfortable Skechers, feeling the warm Florida sand beneath my feet and the sun on my face. When the afternoon heat gets too strong, I sit on my little balcony and lose myself in a good book on my Kindle, enjoying the quiet that I fought so hard to reclaim. I have learned a hard but beautiful lesson through all this. Loving your children with all your heart does not mean you have to give them permission to trample on your soul. Sacrifice is a holy thing, but it only holds its value when it is planted in a place where it is honored and respected. My dear sisters, please never let anyone, not even your own flesh and blood, make you feel like you are a burden or that you are losing your mind. We have spent our entire lives taking care of the world around us, and now it is finally time for us to take care of ourselves. Always remember that you have the absolute right to live in safety, to be treated with the respect you have earned, and to remain the master of the money you worked so hard to make. Do not be afraid of change, because after the storm has passed, the sky will always be brighter and more peaceful than ever before. I wish for you all to stay strong and to find true happiness in every single moment of this life. Thank you for sharing this time with me. It means so much to have you here. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with a sister who needs to hear it. We are never alone when we stand together. Stay strong, keep your light shining, and stay blessed until next time.